Hi everyone, welcome to part 1 of the pen and wash dragonflies tutorial. This is the paper that I use to paint the dragonflies on. This is Artistico 100% cotton watercolour paper. This is 300 GSM in weight, or 140 pounds. And it's just a size A3 pad. I've just torn a piece of paper off that. This is cold pressed paper, but you don't have to use cold pressed paper. You can use hot pressed paper if you prefer. Now I've stretched my paper and I've attached it to a gator board. So if you want to know how I stretch paper, I have a video here on Patreon that will show you how I do that. So I've just drawn some basic dragonfly shapes, and now I'm just adding a bit of detail with my pencil just over the top. This is just an HB mechanical pencil. I'm going to use a Pigma Micron Archival Ink black pen. This is a felt tip pen, and the ink is waterproof and it's archival. So when I eventually put the paint over the top of the ink won't run everywhere because it's waterproof. This is a number 1, so I'm going to use that just to draw over my pencil lines. I've got a few different sizes of these pens and I buy them at my art supply store in Sydney. So I'm just drawing straight over the top of the pencil lines. Some of my lines will be thicker than others. So I'll just speed this section up so that we can get through it quicker. So this is just the easy part of the painting. Just drawing straight over the top of the pencil lines, making some marks thicker than others. You can fill in some areas if you want to, just with the ink. And don't worry too much if your lines aren't perfect and if you go off your pencil lines. Just relax and enjoy it. When I draw the wings, I try to move my whole arm rather than just my hand. I seem to get a smoother line if I do that. But as I said, don't worry if you go off the lines a bit and it goes a bit astray on you. That just adds interest to it anyway. Just use the pencil lines as a guide. Now I've just got an ordinary plastic rubber here. This is a Mars plastic. And I'm just removing the pencil lines. So this is my rubber here. It's just an ordinary one that I got from the newsagent. And these pencil lines need to come off before you put the paint on. I'm going to use 3 colours. This colour is Windsor Lemon. Now this palette has sloping wells, so when I put the paint on, I put the paint on the top of the palette or the highest point of the well. And I'll show you why I do that in a little while. So this is quinacridone Violet. I'm not going to put out a lot of paint because this is just a temporary palette and I don't want to waste the paint. And I'm also going to use some Phthalo Blue Green shade by Daniel Smith. And I'll put that at the top of the well as well. So then I just give them a quick squirt of water. So then by placing the paint at the top of the well, I then have a choice of using the watery paint that falls down to the bottom of the well to get a light colour. So just a pale colour like that. Or I can wipe my brush over the paint at the top of the well. And that will give me the dark pigment. So when I want a darker colour, I do that. So when I use the quinacridone Violet, I do the same thing. I mix up the watery paint and that gives me a pale colour because it's got water mixed into it. Or I can wipe my brush over here where the paint is and I get the darker colour. So that's more pigment there. And same with the blue. The watery paint will give me the lighter wash, the lighter colour. And if I wipe my brush over here, I get the dark pigment. So in this painting I'm going to be blending the colours together. So if I just blend them together on this scrap piece of paper, I can see what they're going to look like. So that'll give me a nice purple colour. And if I mix the yellow with the violet, I get more of a grey. So I might avoid those two colours mixing together, just so that I don't get that grey paint quite so much. But if I put the yellow with the blue, then I get a nice green colour. Now I'm going to use a Da Vinci Maestro brush. This is a round brush, it's a number 5. It's got a nice point on the end of it, which I like to use. And I'm just going to wet this top right wing with some water. Now I'm going to keep the water just on the wing. I don't want it to go onto the body yet, and I don't want it to go onto the background yet. So I just keep the water contained within the wing. Whenever I put water on my paper, I always take care with the application of it, because wherever that water sits, that's where the paint will go. So I need to know exactly where I've put that water. So I've got it within that wing there. And here you can see the water on the paper. It's evenly covered, there's no puddles, there's no dome of water over the top. I've gone over onto this wing here slightly, but I'm not too worried about that at this point. I'm going to use some watery phthalo blue. I dab off the excess on a cloth before I put it onto my painting, because I have water on the paper, I have water in my brush, and I have water in the paint. I just need to take a bit of the excess off on the cloth before I touch my paper. So I paint that carefully along the edge, and I just let it bleed back onto the wing. Now I'm going to pick up some yellow. I've washed my brush out, and I drop the yellow onto that damp paper as well, and I just let it blend with the blue. So the paint will only go where the water is. Now I don't want to play with it too much, because I just want those individual colours to be seen. So if I play with this too much, it'll all turn green. I also think I'd like to try and leave a bit of white paper showing. So I'm going to come over here to this other wing. At the top, I'm going to do the same thing. I wet it with water. I put the water on carefully. I make sure it's evenly covered. If I put too much on, I can use my damp brush to sop some of it back up. So now I've got some of the phthalo blue again, the watery phthalo blue, and I'll just paint that onto the damp paper. Now a little bit of paint goes a fairly long way. And again, I want to try and leave some white paper showing, and I'm also going to pick up some of the yellow paint and drop that in as well. So I'm just going to wash out the brush and pick up some of the watery yellow paint, and I'll drop that onto the blue. And that just blends with the blue paint because the paper's wet. Just take it up to the top edge here. Now I want some of the darker yellow paint, so I pick it up the top there where the paint squirted out, and I'll drop that on there. You can see it's much darker now. I can put a bit on this side as well because it's still wet over here. Okay, now I want to paint these two wings, but I need to wait till the top two dry, because if I paint these ones, the paint will rush into that and disturb it. So I either need to wait for it to dry, or I can give it a bit of a helping hand with a hairdryer. But when you use a hairdryer, you need to be very careful that you don't blow the paint everywhere, particularly if it's quite wet. So just be very careful. Hold it well away if your paper's quite wet, because you will end up spraying it everywhere. Put it on low at first and then turn it up once it's a bit drier. I've done that many times. I've been a bit impatient and then I've ended up spraying the paint everywhere. And as it is, I've got a little bit coming off the edge just over here. But that's okay because I'm going to be painting the background, so I'm not worried about that. Okay, so this time I'm going to wet this wing, but what I want to do now is let the paint just bleed off the wing. So I'm not going to be so careful on the bottom side of the wing. So on this top side of the wing, I want the paint to stay within the wing itself. But down the bottom, I'm quite happy for the paint to bleed off onto the background. So that's why I'm painting the water out further, just past the wing. So remembering wherever that water is, that's where the paint will go. So you can see the water here. I've got a bit too much water there, so I'm just spreading it out, just so that it doesn't form a puddle. I haven't got it on the body of the dragonfly. It's just on the wing and coming down below the wing. And now I've got the quinacridone violet. So it's watery quinacridone violet. Just run it along the top of that wing. And now I can come off the wing. So wherever the water is, that's where the paint will go. Now I've got some of the phthalo blue, watery phthalo blue, and that will blend with the violet. So just drop it wherever you like, just within that water. And you can try and leave a little bit of white paper showing if you can, just on the wing. Just painting it carefully around the body there. I don't want it on the body just yet. You can move the blue paint into the violet if you want, but just don't fuss with them too much, because you want to see those individual colours. Now I've got some yellow that I'm just dropping into the blue there. Now the yellow I've picked up from the top of the palette where the paint is squirted out, just so that it's nice and dark. And then that just blends with the blue and makes a green. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So I'm careful to keep the water within the top of the wing, but then I can bring it down over the bottom of the wing, back onto the background. Take it carefully up to the side of the body as well, because I'm not painting that just yet. Okay, so that's still wet. I've got the phthalo blue now. Take it up carefully against that other wing and around the body there. And then I can let it bleed off the bottom of the wing. Carefully up the top. And then it doesn't matter what it does underneath the wing there. Now I've got some more of the violet. It's just the watery violet. And I've left a little bit of that white paper showing. So now I've got the yellow again, the Windsor lemon, and I've picked that up from the top of the palette where the paint is, just so it's a bit darker. Just going to take the paint carefully beside the body there. Just spread it out down here. So now I've just got water on my brush. Just closing up those little gaps. Just water on my brush now. Just softens away a hard edge there. Now I've got water on my brush again, and I'm just dropping that water onto the paint. It's starting to dry, and when I do that, that just moves some of that pigment and creates little organic shapes. That's called a watercolour bloom. You've got to wait until the paint is starting to dry for it to take effect though. If it's too wet, it won't work. So over here I'm just using my damp brush just to soften away that paint edge. I don't necessarily want a hard edge there. Okay, so now it's dry and I want to start painting the body in. So I'm just going to wet each segment and I'm going to work wet on wet again. So a little bit of water on that segment and a little bit of water on that segment. And I've skipped a segment in between just so that I don't disturb the segment that I'm working on. So here I've got the violet paint. I'm using a smaller brush now. This is a 00 liner brush. And I've picked the paint up from the top of the palette where the paint is so that I get that dark pigment. So it's not the watery paint. So what I want to do with this is keep the colour to the right hand side of the body. So I'm putting the paint on the right hand side and I'm letting it bleed across to the left. And hopefully I'll be able to keep a bit of white paper showing on the left hand side of each segment. So I've just wet the next two. I've got that violet paint again. Drop it on and the water moves it around. All I've got to do really is just tap my brush onto the paper. Because the water's there, it just moves the paint. So I'll wet this little section, pick up the paint from the top of the palette and dab it on to the wet section, the right hand side, and that leaves the white paper showing on the left hand side. Now they're all dry and I can come back in and paint those ones that I haven't painted yet. I'm not going to disturb the ones I have painted because they're dry. I've got the two brushes in my hand. I put the water on with the larger one and the paint on with the smaller one. I can put the water on quicker with the larger brush and I can control where the paint goes more with the smaller brush. I can also use this bigger brush just to dab off a bit of paint if I put too much on. So I keep going down. Wet them, and before they dry I put the paint on. So for the paint to move like that, the paper needs to be damp. I have a video about the different stages of paper wetness, so if it confuses you, it might be a good idea to watch that one as well. Okay, so up here onto this section, I'm just wetting the right hand side here. And now I've got some of the phthalo blue. I put it again on the right hand side of the shape and I let it bleed across to the left hand side. And now I'm just going to take my damp brush and just gently push that paint back. Just with a damp brush, and I'll drop some yellow in there as well. So that's the Windsor lemon that I just dropped in there. Now I'll just wet this shape here, just with some water. And I get some more of that blue paint. Put it on the right hand side and then it bleeds across to the left. And I can use a damp brush again, just to push that paint back a bit. And just cover that area that wasn't covered. So just here the paint is bleeding out beside the dragonfly, so I've just got a wet brush there and I'm just dabbing at it to make it bleed a bit further, just so that I don't get a hard edge. I will be painting the background here later on. Okay, so I dried that off with the hairdryer. Now I'm just wetting this other side of this shape. Again, I put the phthalo blue on the right hand side of the shape. Just dab it on with the brush. And because the paper's wet, it just bleeds across to the left. And I'll just take my larger brush again, just damp with water. And I just rub it over that paint edge, and that just softens that paint edge. I'm also going to drop some of the yellow in there, the Windsor lemon. Got a little bit of paint that's bled across onto this one, so if I just rub a brush over it, it just takes it away. I wet this one. Put the phthalo blue on there again. This is fairly dark phthalo blue, so I've taken it from the top of the palette rather than the watery paint. I take a damp brush again. You can leave it like that and let it dry like that if you want to, or you can take your brush and just soften away that edge. So there's no paint on that brush, it's just damp with water. So now what I want to do is darken this shape. So it's dry, I can paint another layer over the top of it now. I've just wet it with water, and now I'm going to darken this right hand side of the shape with some more of that blue. So you just need to make sure your paper's dry before you paint a second layer. And again, I can take this damp brush just to soften away the paint edge. And then I can even put some more dark paint there just to darken it further. So on this one here, if I want to darken the right hand side, I wet it, and then I put some more paint on the right hand side. I'll do this next one, so I've skipped one. I'll wet it, and then I put the paint on the right hand side. So this is the dark pigment from the top of the palette. So I've wet this one as well. I'm doing the same thing, just using that darker paint on the right hand side, dotting it onto the damp paper. I wet this one, I do the same thing. So I have wet it, and this one as well. Now I'm not going to do the other ones that are in between these ones, I'm just going to leave it like that. So now I'm just going to paint this shape up the top here. So I'll put some water on it again. And then the phthalo blue. Again, on the right hand side, I let it bleed across to the left. And then I'll drop some of the yellow paint, the Windsor lemon, onto that blue side there to make it green. So I've dried everything off with my hairdryer, and I'm just coming back with my black pen now, and I'm just thickening some of the lines. So instead of having all thin lines everywhere, I want some of them to be thicker than others. So that just makes it a bit more interesting to look at. So I'm just thickening up some areas. So you can do that wherever you've got a line that might be a bit wonky, might be a bit crooked. Just make it a bit thicker, like it was meant to be there. So I'll just speed this up. And you can see what I'm doing. I'm just picking areas here and there and just making some lines a bit thicker. Adding a few extra ones. Just use my finished painting as a guide if you're not sure what to do. But if you're a bit more adventurous, you can just play around with it. Okay, so I think I'll leave this one here and I'll start working on the other dragonfly now. So I'm just doing the same thing on this one. I'm just drawing over my pencil lines just to begin with. So like the other one, I just use the pencil lines as a guide. I'm not too bothered if my lines don't match up perfectly. Okay, so I've removed all the pencil lines with the eraser. I'm just coming back now with my pen just to thicken up some lines and add some extra ones wherever I think. Again, you can use my finished painting as a guide as to where to put your markings, or you can do your own thing with it. Just have a bit of fun with it and enjoy it. Thicken up some lines and leave some lines thinner. So I'll just speed this up just so we can get through it. So I'm thickening up some lines there, and some of the lines I leave a bit thinner. Just adding extra little bits in. Just makes it a bit more interesting to look at when you change the thickness of the lines and add some dark parts. Okay, so there's my finished drawing. I've rubbed out all the pencil lines. This brings me to the end of part 1, and in part 2 I'll paint this dragonfly and I'll finish off the background.